When will EVs, or electric vehicles, dominate the auto industry? Rich Kilgore is Associate Professor of Management and Business Administration at Maryville University. Hi, Rich.
How you doing today?
Good. Thanks for being with me today. Now, as you know, Volkswagen has recently announced plans to invest some $131 billion in developing its own models of electric vehicles. And of course, that's joining a number of other automakers who have made similar announcements prior to that. Why are we seeing such a shift toward EVs right now?
Well, I think you've seen the success of Tesla has put a electronic vehicle in the face of a consumer on the road each day. Prior to about 5 years ago, your typical European, Asian, US customer heard about EVs, but didn't see them in the neighborhood, on the highways, and things like that. And that has accelerated the interest now in the transition from ICEs to EVs. We have government initiative also that got highly publicized with the Inflation Reduction Act that made more public the incentives that people were getting to purchase an EV. So the appearance of affordability also has brought out consumers. And obviously you saw the Super Bowl commercials that every major manufacturer, I think, of EVs was out there trying to not just drum up business for their brand, but drum up business for the entire idea of converting from internal combustion to electronic.
So it feels like just about every automaker now has a stake in the transition to EVs, and Tesla's no longer the only game in town. So that seems like an interesting indication of the expansion of this concept. But what are some of the obstacles that might stand in the way of transition to EVs?
Well, I have an interesting background in both capacity planning and strategic planning. And I see this as one of the most difficult capacity planning decisions for an industry ever in the history of business. That you have to decide what is going to be the demand for EVs in advance and make the significant capital investments you have to make to retool or start a new automotive manufacturing, not just assembly facility, but the entire supply chain. Has to decide when over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, are we going to transition from 100% ICEs to 100% electronic vehicles. And that means you really have to run two companies side by side and convince both your dealership network, your supply chain network, and also your local employees and things like that to bear with us, because no one's an expert in how a transition like that happens globally.
And there's always that question of what comes first, demand or the supply. I mean, in other words, you don't have demand without the supply, but the other way doesn't work either. So you've kind of got to balance the two things going forward, right?
That's exactly correct. And in this case, obviously, demand served is going to be limited by supply. And that's the effect of incentives really is more in gaining the confidence that the government is going to be behind this transition and help save their domestic industries, both in the US and overseas as well. They all have a stake in making sure that the automotive industry stays strong for the sake of the economy.
Yeah.
Well, now, go ahead.
Okay. Well, so you talked about the need for a different type of supply chain. And as we know, EVs has many more parts, many more components to them than the internal combustion engine models, and also require a lot more minerals, rare earth minerals and things like that are sourced overseas, whether we like it or not. So that requires quite a different approach to supply chain and continuing overseas sourcing, right?
Absolutely. And that's where the strategic planning part of me starts thinking the real core competency in the electronic vehicle is in the battery. It's not in the engine. And there's a change in the industry and puts more power in the hands of the supplier network to really, I think, eventually might become partners with the automotive assemblers themselves. They will see such the value added is really in the battery range and battery reliability and battery longevity. And pretty soon they will be the ones leading the industry rather than the final assemblers. You might think as the battery people are really going to be subcontracting the assembly of a car which uses their battery. And that's a total turnaround in how the industry views itself.
Even with Tesla's decision to make its own batteries, they still have to draw from suppliers in order to get the elements that go into those batteries. So it doesn't mean they're doing everything in-house after all.
But really, when you look at it, the in-house battery at Tesla is a Panasonic project that is really more outsourcing than it is insourcing, despite what you label it. The expertise long-term is not in the hands of the people currently making automobiles. They are trying to acquire that expertise, but the technology is beyond their core competency. And that's why you're seeing these announcements from Volkswagen, where they're trying to make the world comfortable with the fact, for example, that they can write software. Volkswagen didn't have to write software to make cars 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And the most recent announcement, they made software a high priority because they have to assure their stakeholders that they can do that job in-house.
Do you think we still need to see some more technological progress in the batteries themselves with respect to things like range before EVs can really take off?
Absolutely. I think there's going to be such change, and there's such incentive for change around the world in developing solid state batteries, for example. And I think there's going to be announcements every 5 years or so, and we're going to see a technology development in batteries like we saw with computer chips. Once the PC came out, all of a sudden, the incentive to be a chip manufacturer like Intel became so large that a large amount of technology innovation just came out of the woodwork from places that we didn't expect. And I think the same thing is going to happen here. There are scientists throughout the world looking at this issue much more intently than they ever did. And it is a physics, unlike other problems, we can use chemistry and physics to solve this. We don't have to, create something new technologically that we haven't done before.
What about charging station infrastructure in two elements there? One is the number of them. Two is the time it takes to charge a car, which is a real obstacle, I think, to many car owners. If they have to sit there every time they need to charge their batteries, it's going to take them an hour sitting at a charging station. Where are we on that?
That is an unanswered question. There's obviously a large amount of promises being made about the charging infrastructure, but you still don't see the standardization necessary, I think, in the infrastructure world to make it as convenient as a consumer is going to want it to be. If we have to have 4 different charger, plugs at each infrastructure station, you're going to be stopping far at the interstate. That's not going to give the consumer the confidence they need to make that long distance trip. So I do think while the typical EV customer is going to be either an urban person who's not going to be using that car for a long range trip, or it's going to be the second car in a 2-car family where the EV is the local car and the ICE will be the long distance car. And that'll be a difficult challenge for the automobile manufacturer because there'll still be a demand for ICEs for an SUV or truck to take that long trip or take that heavy duty trip with a lot of cargo in it and things like that.
So you don't see the internal combustion engine going away completely anytime soon then?
No, and that's the difficult part for capacity planning is I do not think that legislatures like the state of California has tried to mandate that there's no new ICE sales. I don't think that sort of political solution is going to be there if the customer is not prepared for it. Mm-hmm. And I think with long distance trips, until the infrastructure is there for charging and giving us total confidence we're going to make the trip without too much inconvenience, people will still want that internal combustion engine for various types of uses, including long distance trip. Mm-hmm. The other issue there in charging is, as you're seeing with Volkswagen's announcement, they have different charging technology in China and Europe and the United States. And that means each of these manufacturers has to have a different type of charging transition for the different areas where they sell their cars. And that also creates a capacity planning. How much do we produce for the domestic production? How much do we produce for European? And the whole export-import of vehicles is being affected by the infrastructure issue as well.
So do you think that both industry and regulators' targets for the transition to EVs are overly optimistic based on some of the challenges and obstacles and issues we've been talking about here?
Absolutely. You're talking about a transition, like I said, it's historic. It's never been done before at a level this large. You have a network of gas stations around the country being fueled by refineries and pipelines, and all that infrastructure for that industry is going to have to disappear and go someplace. And at the same time, the infrastructure for EVs and the supply chain for EVs. And, speaking about oil, we don't know yet whether we have the electric generation capacity in this country to recharge the vehicles and the other types of challenges. We're talking about a cargo fleet of semi trucks that could be electronic, and that's just a huge demand on our electric grid that we don't have a solution for yet. That's not carbon neutral. Mm-hmm. And the idea of an EV and the incentives for EV was carbon neutrality. And if the generation of the raw electricity is not carbon neutral, then we've not accomplished that objective.
So notwithstanding all of this, do you believe that there is going to be at some point a tipping point at which there will be more EVs on the road than internal combustion engine driven cars? And if so, when might that be?
Well, you mentioned supply and demand before, and you also probably recall supply and demand determines price. And if the price of ICEs becomes something that the American consumer or whatever consumer you're talking about overseas feels it's not a good value, they will obviously convert to the option that is the best value. And I do see that being an electronic vehicle. We're seeing in China already, they can produce these things at the $10,000 to $15,000 equivalent in the US marketplace. And if we were allowed to choose that type of vehicle today, I think you'd see a tremendous acceleration in the interest, for that type of vehicle. And if these other problems disappear, like the charging station problem, and also the range of the battery gets up to 500 miles, I think you're going to see a more rapid transition than what we're currently looking at. The other option, by the way, for infrastructure is replaceable batteries that I've seen mentioned in some papers and research, that rather than recharging the battery that's in the vehicle, we'll just pop out that battery and put in a new already charged battery, especially for trucking fleets that don't want to have downtime for drivers. That is an option there for fleet management and things like that.
Interesting. Rich Kilgore of Maryville University, thank you so much for your insights into the development of electronic vehicles and some of the realities that attend their development and their taking on the level of popularity that has been predicted in the years ahead. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.